was appropriate to discuss atrial tachycardia this time. So let's go going. My only request to all of you is, except the speaker and the moderators, you might keep your mics on mute so that there is less disturbance and everybody can concentrate on the presentations. I hope you will enjoy the program as we enjoyed the couple of ones last time. I hand over to Dr. Samir Rane to initiate the scientific proceedings. Samir, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, sir. Very good morning to all of you. I'm Dr. Samir Rane, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this session to all of you esteemed colleagues. I would begin by thanking IHRS for providing us with this encouraging platform for sharing our work and learnings. A special thanks to Dr. Ashish Nabar for enthusiastically working to organize and put together this series of webinars. I would also like to introduce and thank our guest moderators for today, Dr. Haigreev Rao and Dr. Aparna Jaswal, for taking time to participate and share their thoughts in this session. Haigreev sir is a senior consultant cardiologist and electrophysiologist at KIMS Hospitals, Hyderabad. Aparna madam is the director at Fortis Escorts Heart Hospital, New Delhi. And last but not the least, we thank all of you for joining in and supporting us. Today, we are here as representatives of UN Mehta Institute of Cardiology, Ahmedabad. Our presenters today include Dr. Shomu Bora. He's a consultant at this institute for the last 9 years, and he will be talking about clinical presentations and significance of atrial arrhythmias in patients having devices. Dr. Rujuta Parekh is a second-year DM resident with an inclination to EP, and she will present a clinical case of atrial tachycardia. Dr. Riaz Charanya, an assistant professor in cardiology, will talk about atrial arrhythmias and the need to investigate them thoroughly. And myself, Dr. Samir Rane, I'm an assistant professor in cardiology, and I've been working with Shomu sir in the Department of Electrophysiology for the last 3 years. My session today is on atrial tachycardia, ECG to EP study, and would like to begin with Haigreev sir's approval.
Yeah, please go on. We'll start.
Yes, sir. Things to be discussed about focal atrial tachycardias include clinical presentations, ECG findings, electrophysiology study, and ablation. In epidemiology and clinical presentation of focal atrial tachycardias, 3 to 17% of SVTs are focal ATs. 8 to 10% of these patients present with tachycardiomyopathy, and focal atrial tachycardias are most commonly seen in structurally normal heart. The presence of a structural heart disease makes the diagnosis of an atrial flutter more likely. The usual symptoms of a SVT are present, like paroxysmal palpitations, pre-syncope, syncope, and atrial tachycardias are incidentally detected at times during an investigation of a patient. Incessant is a term applied to an AT that is present for at least 50% of the time a patient is being monitored. And in children, these atrial tachycardias are known to resolve spontaneously. The rate of atrial tachycardia determines the nature of presentation of a patient's clinical symptoms. Lower rates escape detection, and hence tachycardiomyopathy are more common in such patients. Faster rates present with paroxysmal palpitations, pre-syncope or syncope. This diagram illustrates the anatomic distribution of focal atrial tachycardias. The right atrium accounts for majority of the focal ATs, and most of these are distributed along a ring of fire, which extends from the superior aspect of the crista terminalis and down the long axis of the crista to the tricuspid annulus, coronary sinus, up to the atrioventricular junction. The next common location are the pulmonary veins. When compared with the ECG of an atrial flutter, the atrial tachycardia shows an isoelectric baseline in between P waves. However, this may not hold true in the presence of a structural heart disease, a post-operative heart, or patient on antiarrhythmic drugs. The P wave duration is less than 160 milliseconds, and the P wave to the atrial cycle length ratio is less than 45%.
Samir, just a small interruption. If you have your pointer on, it would be helpful.
Sir, it's not coming.
With the right click, if you can get the pointer on.
You can just show where the arrows.
Use your mouse otherwise. That's a pointer.
I'm trying, but I am not able to get the mouse on over here. The slide keeps moving ahead. Sorry, sir, it's not happening.
Okay, go ahead then, not an issue.
Then importance of lead V1. It is most useful in identifying the likely anatomical site of origin for the focal atrial tachycardias. Since lead V1 is located to the right and anteriorly in relation to the atria, which should be considered anatomically as right anterior and a left posterior structures. So example, like a tricuspid valve is an anterior structure and focal ATs arising from this area will record a negative deflection in V1. Pulmonary veins are posterior structure and they record a positive deflection in lead V1. This is an algorithm by Keisler et al. The P-wave morphology is determined by the anatomical location of the atrial tachycardia focus and also by the subsequent activation pattern of both the atria. Localization algorithms are a useful guide for localization of an AT focus in a structurally normal heart. Atrial disease or prior surgery renders these algorithms less useful. A simple interpretation of this algorithm is that a negative V1 indicates origin from the right side. Isoelectric suggests a septal origin, and a positive V1 suggests a left-sided origin of focal tachycardia. Positive P waves in inferior leads suggest a superior to inferior activation, while a negative P wave in these leads suggests a inferior to superior activation. There are certain pointers which point to the origin of this focal activation, like terminal lead V1, it's likely RA, a terminal positive V1 is likely LA, negative AVR is right atrium crista terminalis likely. If AVL is positive or biphasic, right atrium likely, right superior pulmonary focus can also exhibit this positive P. A bifid P wave is suggestive of pulmonary vein likely. 1 and AVL both negative points towards left atrial appendage. Inferior and chest leads negative points towards CS body. V1 equiphasic with never negative in a AVL is perinodal. Certain clinical pointers help in localizing the site of origin of the tachycardia. If atrial fibrillation is associated, then left superior pulmonary vein origin is more likely than the left atrial appendage. If on and off multiple times a day is seen more commonly with RSPV than SVC origin. Shorter P wave duration than sinus during tachycardia suggests a septal origin of the P wave. Atrial tachycardia responsive to adenosine is generally seen in perinodal or periannular tachycardias. Reset, but with fusion, is possible only in macro-reentrant tachycardias, but not in focal atrial tachycardias. Then indication, invasive EP study followed by radiofrequency ablation can be done in these cases. It should also be offered when no reversible cause of atrial tachycardia is noted in symptomatic patients. During an EP study, it is important to discuss with the patient and relatives the procedure of EP study in details, including non-inducible tachycardia and hence abandonment of the procedure. Other non-clinical tachycardias which can get induced with pacing protocols. 3D or 2D techniques can be used depending on the availability, familiarity, and cost. Then multiple choices for catheters are available. The mechanism of focal atrial tachycardia does not influence the ablation. Various mechanisms are microentry, automaticity, and triggered activity. Basic principles of EP study are placement of the catheters and mapping the site of interest based on surface ECG, induction of tachycardia, recognition that it is the clinical tachycardia, and then relocalizing based on the ECG in the lab. Measure baseline P wave and the sinus P wave, and mapping, mostly activation mapping. Pace mapping is difficult during ablation of a focal atrial tachycardia. And finally, ablation. Entrainment is a feature mostly seen with macro-reentrant tachycardias. To differentiate between a left side and a right-sided origin, if during tachycardia pacing, from right side causes post-pacing interval minus tachycardia cycle length more than 50 milliseconds, then the tachycardia is from the left side, the opposite side. If it is less than 50 milliseconds, then it is the same right side. Atrial tachycardia, certain features of atrial tachycardias during an EP study. And these are some of the maneuvers to confirm atrial tachycardia in an SVT with 1:1 AV conduction. Initiation of tachycardia with a P wave suggests atrial tachycardia. The A's are more than V and there is no linking. Changes in the AA interval precede changes in the VV interval. V pace during tachycardia shows dissociation, and if entrainment is possible, then a VAAV response to a ventricular overdrive pacing is seen in focal atrial tachycardias. changing AV by VA intervals beat by beat during tachycardia or post-pacing interval minus tachycardia cycle length favors atrial tachycardia. Less than 10 milliseconds, more than 40 milliseconds favors atrial tachycardia, less than 10 milliseconds favors macro-reentrant atrial tachycardia. The atrial activation is less than 60% of the tachycardia cycle length, and variation of more than 15% of the tachycardia cycle length favors a focal AT. AH during A pace during the tachycardia cycle length minus the AH interval during tachycardia, if it's less than 20 milliseconds, suggests atrial tachycardia. And this is a EGM slide which shows induction of tachycardia with an A. Then A is more than V's during the tachycardia. Changes in AA preceding changes in VV with no VA dissociation. V pace causes VA dissociation with continuation of tachycardia. This is the VAAV response to VAV response during an ongoing tachycardia. This is the simplest maneuver to quickly rule out an atrial tachycardia. We have seen that during an ongoing tachycardia, VA dissociation with VOP during a tachycardia rules in AT. But if you have managed to entrain the tachycardia during a VOP and on stopping the VOP, the tachycardia continues with a VAAV response, then it indicates an atrial tachycardia. AV and RT sometimes demonstrate a pseudo VAAV response. That is why it is important to correctly identify the last atrial EGM that is accelerated to the pacing cycle length. So once a focal atrial tachycardia is confirmed, the next step is localizing the focus of activation for a successful ablation. This is done with the help of activation or pace mapping, use of bipolar and unipolar signals, and isolation techniques. During activation mapping, QS in unipolar signal is highly predictive of a successful ablation site. It should be in agreement with the bipolar signals. When unipolar signals are not the best, but nearby field bipolar signals are very early, then nearby sites can be mapped or can be accepted for ablation if no better site is obtained. This is an example of the earliest focus of activation was mapped and ablation was done here, which terminated the tachycardia immediately. There were good bipolar signals here, but unipolars were not clear. Then at the site of for successful ablation, the unipolar signal QS signals were in concordance with the bipolar. They were much earlier than the surface ECG P wave. We have drawn a straight line which shows the unipolar concordance of the unipolar and bipolar EGMs, which are much earlier than the P wave of the atrial tachycardia. Then pace map is useful when tachycardia is not inducible. The exact morphology of the P wave during the tachycardia should be determined and used as a template for pace mapping. Spatial resolution and comparing P wave morphologies with low amplitude or some P waves which are buried in the T waves limit the use of this pace mapping technique. Then focal and fractionated continuous potential suggest microentry, and these are also sites for successful ablation. Focal ATs from pulmonary veins may cause AF and require pulmonary vein isolation. Then 3D mapping is activation maps display the local activation by a color-coded overlay on the acquired 3D geometry. And these focal ATs demonstrate a radial spread of activation from the earliest local site of focal activation, which spreads in all directions. In macro re-entry, the progression of colors is like early meets late activation, suggesting macro re-entrant tachycardia. And in these cases, total activation is in similar range of the TCL. We can go through some case examples of atrial tachycardia. This is an ECG of a patient with paroxysmal normal complex tachycardia, long RP interval, responsive to adenosine, was taken up for EP study and radiofrequency ablation in the view of considering it to be a regular SVT, a AVNRT or AVRT, because it was sensitive to adenosine. The normal AH and HV intervals, RV pacing with central conduction and a VA 2:1 conduction was noted, the bottom half. Then during atrial pacing, narrow complex tachycardia was initiated with an A. And this is a 12-lead ECG of the initiation of atrial tachycardia during atrial pacing. The P wave of the first EGM which follows is a non-sinus beat. And the rest of the complexes which follow have a P wave with the same morphology. The focus of activation appears to be at the tricuspid annulus or the right atrial appendage. So in this tachycardia with 1:1 AV conduction, the AA changes precede the VV changes. Ventricular overdrive pacing during the tachycardia shows VA dissociation, more A's and less V's. Since it was adenosine responsive, when adenosine was administered, two different responses were seen. First, the tachycardia slowed down and terminated in the left half. This was then followed by an AV block and atrial and AV block, which is seen in the right half of the picture. Atrial tachycardia responsive to adenosine suggests perinodal or periannular tachycardias. Now the tricuspid, after this, the tricuspid area annulus was further mapped. And then this, at the tricuspid annulus, the distal electrode of the mapping catheter shows the earliest local EGMs, which are earlier than the atrial signal seen in the distal electrode of the His. A straight line is drawn, which shows the earliest signals in the distal electrode of a mapping catheter, and it is earlier than the A signals of the His catheter. Then on increasing the A caused VA fusion-like complexes, but here unipolar signals are not shown because they are not useful around the annulus. Then with the onset of ablation, there was immediate termination of the tachycardia, and on continuation of energy delivery, few non-sustained beats of tachycardia continued, and finally the tachycardia terminated. Post-ablation, there was no tachycardia induced. Post-ablation, no tachycardia was induced. And case 2 is a case of incessant narrow complex tachycardia in an elderly man, noted to have higher rates, and was being treated as sinus tachycardia with a routine rate controlling medications. The transthoracic echo showed a structurally normal heart. In this 12-lead EKG, the V1 is positive, AVL is negative, localizing it to the superior mitral annulus. Then VV variability is preceded by AA variability, which again confirms atrial tachycardia. Then mapping at the annulus showed a very early local A signal, then the surface P. The mapping catheter is at the annulus, which shows both A and V, and the local A signals are much earlier than the surface ECG P wave. This was almost 43 milliseconds before the surface ECG P waves. Then this was the on initiation of ablation, there was immediate acceleration followed by termination of the tachycardia, as evident by change in the P wave morphology. V1, which was positive, changed to positive negative. The two orange arrows indicate the left arrow indicates the P wave of the atrial tachycardia, while the right arrow is showing the P of the sinus beat. And case 3 is a case of short runs of atrial tachycardia. P wave morphology was not clear due to overlap with the T waves. A straight line drawn at the P wave shows that the onset of the T wave was buried in the T wave. Of the P wave was buried in the T wave, sorry. This is the 12-lead ECG of the same tachycardia. Again, no discernible P waves. Then the first beat is a sinus beat followed by runs of atrial tachycardia. In the sinus beat, the atrial activation is seen earliest in the His catheter, and when compared to the signals in the mapping catheter during the tachycardia, the His A is now late. CA signals are earlier than the His, and hence the LA was mapped. Mapping catheter shows the earliest A signals. Then the mapping catheter is being moved around the mitral valve annular area and the left inferior pulmonary vein area. Earliest atrial EGMs are seen in the LIPV area. Ablation done here was successful, terminated the tachycardia. and three different presentations of atrial tachycardia. In example one, adenosine, we have seen that adenosine sensitive atrial tachycardias exist. Not all adenosine sensitive SVTs are AV nodal dependent tachycardias. So it is imperative to perform these pacing maneuvers to rule out atrial tachycardias. Atrial tachycardias can also present with slower rates and may be overlooked. Careful examination of surface ECGs can shed light upon the tachycardia. In the third case, the onset of P waves during the tachycardia remained buried in the preceding T or wave or the QRS. In such cases where the onset is not visible, a surrogate marker like a stable CS or a high right atrium EGM is used to determine the earlier local EGM. In summary, it is recognize it is an atrial tachycardia on ECG and localize it to the site of origin using the algorithms available. On EP study, first confirm it to be AT. Activation mapping is the backbone for successful termination of an atrial tachycardia, and ablation is successful most of the time. Thank you. Agriv, sir.
Very good presentation, Samir.
Thank you, sir.
I know it's such a big topic. You know, 3 or 4 chapters you have to condense in a small time.
Yes, sir.
So what I thought I would do is I will complement what you said. You know, in the sense that the things that are important for the cardiology trainees, which obviously because of want of time you could not complete. Let
Yes.
me fill in a few things. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Now,
to share screen, Hygriv, or
not yet. I don't have any present things right now. I'll have 1 or 2 slides. I'll let you know then. See, the first thing is, yeah, you can unshare, Samir, so that whenever I want, I can. Now, the first thing I would like to say is the problem comes to a regular cardiologist is when faced with a regular SVT, which he has shown. Now, as you have shown, when a person has a narrow, regular tachycardia, narrow QRS tachycardia, now, how do you know it is an AT? That is the first problem that a DNB or anybody faces. You know, it's always confusing where you say AVRT, AVNRT, and an expert comes and says it's an AT. So I would like to say a few important clinical points. The first thing is, if you have a long RP tachycardia, as he has shown, a P which is far away has already been shown, it is certainly a pointer. Now, more important than that is the clinical pointers. Suppose you have clinical pointers like a patient, you're called in to see a patient with COPD, a patient who has undergone some surgery, and you're called in to see a regular narrow QRS tachycardia, or a patient who has heart diseases like a post-ASD surgery, or a mitral valve disease, rheumatic or non-rheumatic, anything, or an LV dysfunction, old myocardial infarction. If you have these kind of clinical scenarios and regular narrow QRS tachycardia, you should first suspect an atrial tachycardia before you think of an AVRT or AVNRT. These are clinical pointers, because always we don't make a diagnosis by ECG as people think. Many times it is used a clinical pointers that we use. These are the 6 clinical pointers that we use. Second thing is, if you have a Holter where you have a lot of narrow QRS tachycardia and they're coming in bursts, you have a burst of tachycardia at 10, 15, and again a short burst, short burst. Generally, these kind of bursts happen with AT and not with AVNRT or AVRT. This is again a pointer towards these kind of things. And second thing is drugs. If a patient is on Lenoxin, it's very rare these days, I know. And then, you know, it always points that a tachycardia on Lenoxin, you must always think of an atrial tachycardia, not an AVNRT or AVRT. So these are the clinical pointers that I would like to say. The second aspect is the adenosine. He briefly, Samir briefly showed a case where the adenosine was used. And it is extremely important for cardiology residents to know the importance of adenosine in SVT. Now, there are 4 responses if you have an adenosine with a narrow QRS tachycardia. Now, don't try to make a diagnosis of AT just like that, although this talk is on AT. Just make a diagnosis of a regular narrow QRS tachycardia. Suppose you have a regular narrow QRS tachycardia, you give adenosine. Now, watch how it terminates. There are 2 ways it terminates. If it terminates with a P wave followed by a block, you have a P and a block. That is generally a AVNRT or AVNRT. Now, you can have a SVT which just stops, again, as Samir has shown, where there is a PQRS and then suddenly the tachycardia stops. Again, this is a thing. Now, the third thing is where I would like to show is where you have a atrial, where you have an SVT and it blocks with, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this slide if it's possible. Yeah. Now, if you have an SVT that can you see the slide? Not yet.
Yes, we
please.
Yeah, you can see. Now you can see this is a slide where this is the atrial electrograms. That means this
Just
is
go
a
to the
catheter.
view mode, na?
Yeah, this is a yeah. This is one. Yeah, this is a catheter which is placed in the atria. You can see the atrial electrograms. This is the ECG, a PQRS and all that, PQRS. Now you see when an adenosine is given, it blocks the AV node completely. So you see no QRS complexes in the ECG at all, completely blocked. But what you can see is a lot of atrial electrograms. Here it is an atrial fibrillation because there's an irregularity, but in atrial tachycardia also it looks something like this. So what you see is a lot of atrial electrograms, but no QRS complex. So adenosine can act in this manner also. It can act in this manner where you have a continuing of arrhythmia. So it is not that adenosine has not acted. Generally, the residents tell me that we give adenosine and the tachycardia persists. It is not the tachycardia is persisting. You have made a diagnosis. So these are the four methods in which you have adenosine acting. Adenosine can certainly help you to make a diagnosis of atrial tachycardia. So if you have an SVT, you give adenosine and the atrial activity continues, it will give you a diagnosis of atrial tachycardia and also help you to decipher the P wave morphology, which will make it easier for you to diagnose. The third point I'd like to make is what is the importance of making a diagnosis of atrial tachycardia versus atrial flutter. Again, an important point. It is important. Now, when you have a structural heart disease, again, if you have an atrial tachycardia, generally try to make a diagnosis of flutter. Look that the flutter is there because it's more likely to exist than a focal tachycardia. But this is not a Bible rule. You can always have things, but generally a clinical pointer. A patient with atrial tachycardia and LV dysfunction, or a patient with atrial tachycardia with a structural abnormality of the heart, you always should make a diagnosis of. You should think of a diagnosis of flutter more often than a focal tachycardia. Now, it is important because in flutter, if you have a diabetes, hypertension, and a high CHAD score, these are the patients with high risk of strokes. So there is additional requirement of oral anticoagulation in these patients. So it is clinically important to make the diagnosis. It is not just an ECG diagnosis. Now, another point is, how do you make a differentiation between sinus tachycardia and atrial tachycardia? This is another commonly asked question where Dr. Samir showed a very good example, has a point, a nice thing which was mistaken for atrial tachycardia. The sinus tachycardia was mistaken. Now, generally, if you have both sinus and atrial tachycardia, it's easier, but sometimes a patient comes only with that, you're not sure. So if you have rates of more than 150 or so, more likely it is an atrial tachycardia. Second thing, the P wave morphology is extremely important. Now, if you have a positive in V1 and you have a negative, a positive in AVR, very unlikely it's a sinus. And similarly, if you have a negative in all V2 to V6, unlikely it's a sinus. So these are some pointers. And second thing is, if you have an Holter and you have some areas where it is slowing down, you possibly have a different morphologies. You can see the varying of PR interval. A PR interval, which suppose you have a focus of atrial tachycardia, which is closer to the AV node, you have a shorter PR interval when compared to the sinus, and vice versa. So a varying PR, a differential PR interval also helps. Now, a lot has been said about the algorithm of POs. Now, it is very correct that you have an algorithms. Now, many times for an average cardiologist, it's not easy to remember the algorithms of VTs as well as ATs. So it's important, as Samir has showed one slide, I'd just like to reemphasize some important points to the residents. First thing is, if you have a positive P waves that in the inferior leads, 2, 3 AVF, that is a focus is coming from above. So you have a superior part of the crista terminalis or a close to the sinus node, high right atrium. These are all the right superior pulmonary veins. See, you see all our top areas. So above downwards, you have a positive 2-3 AVF. And conversely, if you have a negative 2-3 AVF, it is coming from the lower part of the crista terminalis or a coronary sinus. So a focus arising from there. This is a concept. So 2-3 AVF is an important thing. Similarly, V1, he has particularly emphasized the V1. A V1 positive indicates the left-sided, a V1 negative indicates the right-sided. And if you have a negative concordance in all the V2, V3, V4, V6, probably a tricuspid anomalous. So what I'm saying is these are the conceptual things. It's easy to remember than algorithms. That these leads, if you look at it, it will help us a lot. And please remember, focal atrial tachycardias have specific locations. It's not that they come all over, because when I was doing cardiology, focal, I thought that it can come anywhere in the right atrium and left atrium, so it was very confusing to me. Now, what I'd like to emphasize is that they have very specific areas only. So the expert comes and says, oh, it's coming from CS-os. So you think that guy is a real genius. It's coming from, it's not like that. There are only few areas it comes from. So you have in the right atrium, it comes from the close to the sinus node, high right atrium. It's from the crista, upper crista, lower crista. Or it can come from the coronary sinus, a triangle of Cox or a CS-os. These are the common locations, right atrium. In the left atrium, similarly, it is in the pulmonary veins, the left or the right pulmonary veins, or rarely left atrial appendage. These are common things. They are very rare things. They are common things. Another thing a very important concept that I'd like to share is this. Is you see, this is is my slide seen? This is his catheter, as has been shown. It tells you what is his location. Now, tachycardias can come sometimes from this area, his area. Now, important concept I want to show is that this is a catheter coming from the aorta into the non-coronary cusp. So, an important anatomical concept which all postgraduates need to recognize is that the his is not just in the right atrium, but a non-coronary cusp of the aortic sinuses is so close, you see, anatomically to the his. So these tachycardias, they come. It is not important. This is rare. I'm not expecting you to diagnose a his tachycardia, but I want you to appreciate the anatomical concept that a non-coronary cusp is so close to the his tachycardia, and these can also help. And the final point that I'd like to tell you in the electrograms are always confusing for a person who has not entered the cath lab, but then important points is that if you have a atrial electrograms, which are more than the ventricular electrograms, it's an atrial tachycardia. And typically in the Hill's catheter, you have an AHV, less like the sinus. Atrial tachycardia is a AHV tachycardia. Now, if you have a atrial electrogram, which is closer in the coronary sinus proximal, it is likely to be in the right atrial tachycardia. If you have a atrial electrogram, which is very early than the P waves in the distal coronary sinus, is a left atrium. This is an important concept. And if it is close to the his, as I said, it is his tachycardia. Now, I just wanted to summarize and complement a few things that Samir has said rapidly, so that it will, serve as a summary of what he has said. Any other points, Shomu, Ashish?
I think Yash is on the line. Yash, you want to say a few things?
No, I think Haigreve has, in a short while, given a lot of pearls. I just want to add one clinical situation which is very common, that when a patient is admitted in the ICU with sometimes on inotropes or sepsis or whatever, or with an incessant narrow-QRS tachycardia, you're thinking it is atrial tachycardia, atrial flutter, or SVT. And the resident calls and tells you that we gave adenosine, it terminated and restarted immediately. Usually this is wrong. And I always insist that take the ECG strip during the adenosine, not before and after, or keep your mobile on the monitor screen while adenosine is being given. Mostly these will be atrial tachycardias or flutter, where there is a transient AV block with adenosine, and all 99 out of 100 residents or intensivists misdiagnose this as termination followed by restart. This in fact helps you to diagnose atrial tachycardia, that with adenosine you get a transient AV block, but the P waves are brought out, rapid P waves, and then it again goes to one-to-one conduction. This is a very common scenario which all the people, especially the students who are attending today, must keep in mind. That was all I wanted to add.
Sure. Thanks, Yash. I think this always
Just one point, Dr. Ashish.
Aparna. Yeah, please come in.
Quickly, I think everything well said, taken very well. Just for the residents, one point I want to make is that transition zones are very important when you are seeing a halter. Look at the onset and look at the termination. That will try and answer many things. If the onset of a tachycardia you are seeing with the prolongation of a PR and subsequently you are not able to see a P, it gives you an idea you may be dealing with a load-dependent tachycardia. And as Dr. Haigreve mentioned, termination of a tachycardia is extremely important. Remember, P-wave termination of a tachycardia nearly excludes atrial tachycardia. So these are certain pointers, the transition zone you must try to focus clinically before concluding what are you dealing with.
Sure. It was very productive. I think, should we hand over the floor to Rujuta, Samir?
Yeah, Rujuta can take over from now.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I hope I'm audible.
Yes, very much.
Good morning. I'll be presenting a case of a clinical case of atrial tachycardia.
You can share your slides, yeah, Rujuta. Please share your screen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So we had an 11-year-old boy who was admitted with a history of fast palpitations with breathlessness on exertion of 1 month duration. His heart rate was noted to be 180 to 210 per minute, and he was being treated as sinus tachycardia with failure. But his ECG was suggestive of a narrow QRS long RP regular tachycardia. So the differential diagnosis was an AVRT, an atypical AVNRT, atrial tachycardia, a sino-atrial reentrant tachycardia, or maybe an appropriate or an inappropriate sinus tachycardia. However, a negative P in V1 and V2 suggests an origin that is different from the sinus node. Hence, sinus tachycardia looks unlikely. Also, positive P in 2-3 AVF goes against the diagnosis of AVNRT, where the P wave in the inferior leads should ideally be negative. Also in the CCG, a negative P in V1 and AVR and a positive P in AVL suggests a right atrial origin, and a positive P in 2-3 AVF suggests that it is a superiorly origin tachycardia. The transthoracic echocardiogram showed reduced LV ejection fraction. After IV adenosine, the ventricular rate slowed down, but the tachycardia persisted with A more than V, which favors an atrial tachycardia and rules out AVNRT, AVRT, and SNRT. So we were left with the differential diagnosis of an atrial tachycardia, the points in favor being the P wave morphology and also persistently raised heart rate, which was not normalizing even on resting. Sinus tachycardia was also considered in view of LV dysfunction and the clinical symptoms of failure. The patient, when he was referred to us, had been given IV amiodarone and IV digoxin outside, and he was on oral carvedilol, amiodarone, and digoxin. But his heart rate was still uncontrolled with incessant tachycardia, and there was no respite since nearly 1 month. On referral to us, this was the ECG with the fast heart rates. An increase in dosage of the drugs was not contemplated because the blood pressure kept at around 90 mm systolic. So when he was referred to us, the options of management included an EP study and an RFA, but the relatives were not immediately willing for financial constraints. They were also not willing for DC cardioversion. Additional drugs that could have been added was flecainide and propafenone, but they were not available back in 2012. Sotalol could not be given in view of LV dysfunction. So ivabradine was added for him. 2 days after adding ivabradine, the tachycardia went away. Also, the P waves in V1 and V2 became a positive negative, which suggested that the origin was close to the sinus node. After stopping ivabradine, to see whether the tachycardia had responded to ivabradine or not, because he was on other drugs also, the patient had recurrence of tachycardia on the second day of stopping ivabradine. So he was again started. and he became asymptomatic that day. Also, amiodarone and digoxin was discontinued, and he was continued only on carvedilol and ivabradine. An echo was called after 1 month. At that time, he was asymptomatic with a heart rate control to 80 beats per minute. The echo on follow-up showed that the LV function had normalized. So the diagnosis of an ivabradine sensitive incessant focal atrial tachycardia with tachycardiomyopathy was kept. Focal atrial tachycardias can be paroxysmal or incessant. They can be a result of one or a combination of mechanism, which includes automaticity, triggered activity, or re-entry. Since our patient was ivabradine responsive, looks like automaticity was the mechanism here. 8 to 10% of patients present with atrial tachycardia with tachycardiomyopathy, especially in the pediatric age group. The treatment includes rate control with beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, or digoxin, and rhythm control with antiarrhythmic medications, DC cardioversion, or an EP study and radiofrequency ablation. On follow-up, the patient preferred medical management and remained asymptomatic with normal heart rates on ivabradine. After 1 year, he was lost to follow-up. After 3 years, he again presented with similar complaints after stopping ivabradine. Again, LV dysfunction was noted with an EF of 30%, and he was symptomatic for heart failure. ECG again showed same tachycardia as previously, a negative P in V1 and including V2, V3, and V4, and a positive P in 2, 3, and AVF suggested a right atrial appendage origin or a right atrial appendage origin or a tricuspid annulus in origin. So this is the 12-lead ECG that showed that the tachycardia during EP study. This was a 12-lead ECG that showed that the tachycardia was same as the clinical tachycardia. This tracing shows a narrow complex tachycardia with a cycle length of 377 millisecond, with the earliest A recorded from the high RA catheter and a positive HV interval with 1:1 AV association. V pacing during tachycardia showed that VA dissociation, which confirmed it to be an atrial tachycardia. Adenosine was given, which decreased the ventricular rates with no change in the P wave rates, which ruled out AVRT and AVNRT. This is the 12-lead ECG post-adenosine, which gives a clearer P wave morphology. P is negative in V1 and V2, and it is positive in the inferior leads, which localized it to the tricuspid annulus or the RA appendage. Atrial pacing did not terminate the tachycardia anytime. Pacing from the CS region showed the return cycle length was 487 millisecond, which is 50 millisecond longer than the tachycardia cycle length of 378, which suggested origin from the opposite atrium, which is the right atrium. Hence, mapping was done in the right atrium, and ablation catheter was moved to the RA appendage. Pacing from the ablation distal electrode, the return cycle length was the same as the tachycardia cycle length of 396, which suggested RA appendage in origin. The P wave morphology on ECG tracings during clinical tachycardia and on pace mapping from the RA appendage had a similar P wave morphology, which suggested that the origin was from the same region. Activation mapping in the map distal has potential that is arising 36 millisecond earlier to the P wave, and unipolar signals could not be shown as noise was present, and hence they were removed. Otherwise, they would have been ideal. Pace mapping and activation mapping shows the focus of activation at the RA appendage, and that was the successful site of ablation. On initiation of ablation with a routine catheter, there was acceleration of the tachycardia with no termination, suggesting that the foci was nearby. However, with routine catheter, energy delivery was not good. So irrigation catheter and saline irrigation at the local site was required. Using a multi-purpose catheter, saline irrigation was done in the same area, and ablation delivered with good power in the absence of cool tip catheter. Delivery of energy caused slowing followed by termination of the tachycardia. Now the 12-lead ECG shows a positive and a positive negative P wave in V1 and V2, and which was initially negative. So this suggested a sinus nodal in origin. Post-ablation tachycardia was not inducible on pacing protocols, and sinus rhythm was achieved post-ablation. So the learning points from our EP study was that ECG localization is important pre-study. Adenosine during atrial tachycardia is helpful to bring out the P waves. Adenosine sensitive atrial tachycardias are usually periannular or perinodal. Pacing protocols helps in diagnosing the atrial tachycardia, and they also help in localizing the chamber. Entrainment mapping is helpful in localizing the focal point of origin of the atrial tachycardia. Activation mapping is important and should always be compared to the onset of P waves if possible, or the earliest A wave in other catheters. Pace mapping can be difficult but useful, and ablation may require a cool tip catheter, especially when in the appendage. The final diagnosis of an incessant focal atrial tachycardia with tachycardiomyopathy, which was ivabradine sensitive, and successfully it was ablated at the RA appendage. Ivabradine responsive atrial tachycardias generally are seen arising from the atrial appendages in a study done at the Institute. Thank you.
Nice. Haigreve, I just wanted to come in to say if you can explain two things in your discussion. One is elaborate on tachycardiomyopathy, and then using conventional catheters, how do you guess where the origin of the focal atrial tachycardia is?
Yeah, a very pertinent point. Before I go on to these two questions, and the thing that I wanted to say, general talk is to emphasize the importance of drug therapy. A very nice demonstration of in 2012 itself of use of ivabradine to terminate atrial tachycardias. Now, this is generally a lesser known medication in these things. Now, it is known that those atrial tachycardias which arise from the vicinity of sinus node, they are responsive to ivabradine, one of the additional drugs. So it is a commendable demonstration of this thing in the example. Now, coming to your question on tachycardiomyopathy. Now, the thing is, most of the cases where tachycardiomyopathy is seen, that is atrial arrhythmias, let's fix to atrial arrhythmias or AV nodal arrhythmias, which cause progressive decrease in LV function and heart failure. Now, these are generally not the rapid atrial tachycardias, but on the contrary, the slow tachycardias, the slow incessant tachycardias which lead to it. Now, these are predominantly seen in the younger population. And one of the commonest things apart from this is a slowly conducting PJRT, or the slowly conducting decremental posterior-septal pathways. And these cause a slow tachycardias which are incessant and which lead to heart failure. The second thing is the atrial tachycardias, which are it can be even re-entrant, some of the, but typically the focal tachycardias are not very common, but they have been known to cause progressive LV dysfunction. And but the way to recognize is typically these are incessant, slow, younger population, and they are unresponsive to drugs as well as to cardioversion, repeated cardioversions. And most of the time, no doubt they have shown ivabradine in this case, but it's not always near the sinus node they exist. Typically, most of these are amenable to radiofrequency ablation, and that is generally the treatment of choice, and they reverse the heart failure immediately. Now, the 3D mapping has, now coming to the second part of Ashish's question, 3D mapping no doubt has proven beyond doubt that the ease of mapping and ablating tachycardias, both atrial and ventricular, because in case of focal tachycardias, what is shown in one of the slides is very nicely shown is a centrifugal propagation of the atrial arrhythmia from a single focus, which gives the operator an ease of diagnosis of the focus of the location of the atrial arrhythmia, and hence an ablation. But then conventional catheters have always been in vogue, and to this date, majority of the centers still use conventional catheters. And the slide which I had shown in the previous case was a conventional catheter used to ablate an atrial tachycardia. What I had shown about a few minutes back of a catheter which is in the proximity of his and which is due to non-coronary cusp. Because 3D mapping, all said and done, availability is one thing and the expense is another thing. These two things prohibit the use in many of the situations. Even in our case, the government schemes, it's not easy to procure them. So the conventional catheters, the first thing is when you map the atrial tachycardia, the coronary sinus is most often an important catheter, the right atrial catheter and the his catheter. By use these three catheters, we generally locate whether you are talking about a left atrial tachycardia or a right atrial tachycardia. After diagnosing a atrial tachycardia, you see the atrial electrograms with respect to the P waves. It's always, ECG is very important. So whenever we ablate, it is not the earlier from one catheter to another, but earlier than the P wave, which is very important. Now you have a catheter which is in the coronary sinus. The proximal coronary sinus lies in the right atrium. The distal coronary sinus, it is envelops the mitral annulus and it lies in the left atrium, and for a very simplistic way. So if you have a atrial electrogram earlier than the P wave in the proximal coronary sinus than the distal coronary sinus, that means we are dealing with a right atrial location. And similarly, if you have a distal coronary sinus, you have the left atrium. Having deciphered basically between right and left atrium, then in the right atrium, you use the right atrial catheter and the His catheter and the CS-OS. With these three catheters, you try to locate whether your atrial focus is coming from the high right atrium or close to the sinus node, or close to the His, or close to the coronary sinus. As I said earlier, the atrial tachycardias don't occur all over the heart. They have a very specific locations. So if you have a catheter which is closer to the right atrium, you map in the area of the sinus node and the high right atrium. If you have close to the coronary sinus, you map in the triangle of Koch, like you do for AVNRT, or in the CS-OS. And then, of course, then if these two things are not earlier, then you go into the tricuspid annulus and map. Tricuspid annulus is like a clock. Electrophysiologists like to call it as a 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, just like a clock in the LAO position. So you go into each of these annulus locations and try to find which is earlier. Suppose you don't find any of these and you look to the opposite side. The CS distal is earlier. You know it is in the left atrium. In the left atrium too, the locations are the pulmonary veins. So the way we do it is you place one catheter in the left pulmonary vein, one catheter in the right pulmonary vein, and try to find out which is earlier than the other. And once you locate the site, is it left or right, then you go into the upper and lower. And so electrophysiologists painstakingly, point by point, try to find earlier in the known locations of the focal atrial tachycardias. So in the right side, triangle of Koch, the CS-OS, the tricuspid annulus, the crista, the high right atrium, the His. So when you find it the His, as I said, burning at the His is a very dangerous thing. I showed in the slide, you go into the non-coronary cusp and try to map it. In the left side, it is a left pulmonary vein, right pulmonary vein, or very rarely you go into the left atrial appendage and mitral annulus. These are just like the tricuspid annulus. These are the systematic way to map with a conventional catheter using this one.
Correct. So this kind of a deductive thinking is required using multiple catheters to try and narrow down to the approximate region from where the atrial tachycardia comes. And then with your ablation catheter, you try to fine tune and find a site which is as early with reference to the onset of the P wave. That's how you would localize a focal tachycardia. I think once again, in the interest of time, we need to move. And the next two sessions will be moderated by Dr. Aparna Jaswal, and Dr. Riaz would want to present his case. Yes.
Dr. Ashish, I'll just make one comment amongst the drug therapy which Dr. Highgrave did talk about. I think one drug which we must remember is the class 1C, that is flecainide, which is now easily available. You must rule out structural heart disease, and you can consider this molecule for those of your patients who are not willing for an ablation, because it is rewarding, and especially if you combine it with the beta blocker. The second point I want to bring out is a question which comes about ivabradine. Now, ivabradine, we thought act only on the funny channels as well as on the retina, but there is data now coming up, just like in atrial tachycardias, also in atrial fibrillation, people are beginning to consider ivabradine because it is thought that it acts on that HCN4 gene, which is present throughout the myocardium as well as in the AV node. So there are data that, yes, because somebody's also posted a question asking about the role of ivabradine in atrial fibrillation rate controlling. Well, we're not using it typically, but just as Dr. Shomu's group has shown ivabradine's role in atrial tachycardia, we may have more data about the role of ivabradine in controlling heart rate in atrial fibrillation. So that's where we are with that. So I think that's two things that I wanted to bring out.
Right. Yes, you can.
I would also like to stress that amiodarone should not be given as the first choice in any of the atrial tachycardias, since now we have flecainide available, as Dr. Aparna has said. So over to Riaz. Yeah. Riaz can share his slides.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, ma'am. So, today I'll be talking about atrial arrhythmias and why we need to investigate them thoroughly. So, for atrial arrhythmias, apart from degenerative and idiopathic causes, we have to look for some potentially reversible causes, which includes sleep apnea, some inflammatory causes, myocarditis and pericarditis, which can be because of autoimmune disease or of infectious etiology. Autoimmune diseases like sarcoidosis and lupus, and infection in our country, you should specifically look for tuberculosis, and recently with the COVID pandemic, viral myocarditis. Always look for structural heart disease, especially the both the atrias, and we need to have a proper echocardiographic evaluation to look for the same. Thinking mind about toxins, malignancy, and metastatic disease. Now, sometimes these arrhythmias are the first manifestation of the underlying disease, and they may even help us to identify and diagnose the underlying disease. So, this is my first case. He's a young 30-year-old resident doctor who had presented to us with the 3 days history of palpitations with no other systemic features. There is no history of any alcohol intake. The 2D echocardiography done was normal. ECG shows fibrillation and flutter. All the routine blood investigations done were normal. The thyroid was normal. So we went ahead to further investigate this case. The HRCT test was done, which was suggestive of enlarged mediastinal necrotic lymph nodes, and a differential diagnosis of tuberculosis versus sarcoidosis was given. A further investigation of with FDG PET shows lymph nodes with pericardial granulomas. The cardiac MRI done had similar findings. So we went ahead to do a IBUS guided lymph node biopsy, which was done, which shows the granulomatous lymphadenitis of undetermined origin, undetermined etiology. MON2 test was positive in our patient, so the COX treatment was started and was taken for 6 months. The arrhythmia didn't recur thereafter. The patient is asymptomatic. A repeat CT scan was also done after 6 months, which showed no enlarged lymph nodes. So this is our first case, which shows that the atrial arrhythmia is likely because of tubercular pericarditis, and which was treated and it didn't recur after the COX treatment. So our second case is a 55-year-old female who is known hypothyroid on regular treatment. She presented with us with palpitations and pre-syncope with history of fever since 5 days. Echocardiography done was normal. Inflammatory markers were raised. CRP level of 78, D-dimer was raised, and troponin I was elevated. So the ECG suggests of atrial tachycardia with sinus bradycardia. She had tachybrady with long pauses, so she required a temporary pacemaker. And the lady presented with during the ongoing pandemic of COVID-19. So the CT test was done, which was suggestive of a COVID, and the PCR COVID-19 tested resulted in positive COVID-19. So the steroids were given considering COVID myocarditis, and this was even before the recommendations of routine use of steroid, which were given in COVID later on. So we saw an immediate response with steroid within 2 days. The ECG above shows us normal sinus rhythm. The patient became asymptomatic and she recovered fully within 2 weeks and didn't require any add-on drugs. So this is the second case which shows the atrial arrhythmia, which was likely because of COVID myocarditis, considering the raised elevated troponin I, and which immediately resolved with steroid treatment. Our third case is a 52-year-old female presented with fatigue and palpitations. She's having intermittent bradycardia and tachycardia. ECG was suggestive of atypical flutter 2:1 with sinus bradycardia and junctional rhythm. All the routine blood investigations done were normal. Echo was reported normal. Holter showed tachycardia along with unprovoked sinus bradycardia. CT chest was done, which showed lymphadenopathy and a mass in the upper wall of right atrium. The MRI showed again right atrial mass, and the FDG PET showed active nodules in the breast tissue, right atrium, and femur. So we went ahead again to see a retrospective echo and can see there is a echogenic mass attached to the right atrial wall. So the diagnosis of CA breast was confirmed histologically and was surgically removed. So this is the third case which shows that the atrial arrhythmia in this case was likely because of an infiltrative disease because of metastasis from breast cancer. This patient later on required a permanent pacemaker also. So our next case was a 32-year-old female who presented with palpitations during her pregnancy in 2011. ECG shows a regular narrow complex tachycardia. Adenosine was given, did not terminate the tachycardia but slowed the ventricular rate, and which helped us diagnose atrial tachycardia. She was kept on medical follow-up as it was only single episode and she didn't require any medications thereafter. The 2D echography done at that event was normal. She ran a 5 years of asymptomatic course and then again in 2016 presented to us with same atrial tachycardia. The echo done during this time showed a dilated RA with an increase in flow in RA suggesting of some shunt lesion. CT scan confirmed the diagnosis of aorta to RA fistula. So angiography was done and the fistula was closed with device. So a fourth case shows the atrial tachycardia because of the structural heart disease which was treated and then the arrhythmia didn't recur. Coming to our fifth case, she is a 46-year-old lady presented with palpitations and pre-syncope. ECG shows sinus brady with Wenke backing, AV block, and Holter was suggestive of atrial flutter with variable blocks. So EF, this patient had a permanent pacemaker from outside and was referred to our center for a CRT upgrade because the EF started to decrease to 35% and the patient was symptomatic for dyspnea. Now this patient is a young female with sinus node dysfunction, AV nodal disease, and atrial arrhythmias. So we went ahead to look for the causes of why she is having such a disease. So all the routine investigations were normal except for a very high ESR of 98. FDG PET was normal, MRI was not done, and she was found to be anti-nuclear antibody positive and anti-Rho positive. So she was diagnosed with the autoimmune disease and steroids were given. The EF normalized, there was no flutter thereafter. However, the AV block had continued. So this case shows us the atrial arrhythmia because of an autoimmune disease etiology. So this is the various case reports and case series which are presented and reported in journals, which does show the reversible causes of atrial arrhythmias, and we have to look after it, some of which I have all discussed. Some other noted were like left atrial myxomas presenting as SVTs, rheumatoid arthritis, SLE, inflammatory bowel disease presenting as atrial fibrillation, coronavirus disease with new onset atrial fibrillation. So we have to look for the reversible causes. So when should we suspect, especially in young patients, female with an acute history, with systemic symptoms suggestive of an inflammatory or autoimmune or infectious etiology? STT changes will suggest in inflammatory cause. Pericardial effusion suggests again inflammatory cause. A lower EF or a restrictive feeling we can see in inflammatory and autoimmune diseases. So atrial arrhythmias without atrial abnormality should be evaluated well as we do in ventricular tachycardia in a normal heart. Inflammatory autoimmune workup, CT scan, FDG PET, endocrine workup should be done in routine in young patients, especially when the echocardiography is normal. These atrial arrhythmias can be transient, the cause of which may not be immediately evident, as we had seen in one of our cases, and intracardiac abnormalities may be detected later on in time, and atrial arrhythmias may be the first manifestation of the underlying disease. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Riaz. I think that was a very good cases that you showed on. So I think a couple of things which I would just want to reinforce for the want of time, I'll keep it short, that we have to essentially I think COVID times have shown us that we should really look at the inflammatory markers, because they give us a lot of information. And as you've just seen from the cases so well elicited, that it was the inflammatory markers which are so easily available everywhere. You don't have to depend upon higher end tests. They give you a cue that maybe you need to look deeper. That was one. And second, I think we have to remember that always keep, when you look at arrhythmias, we are not still adept and we are not looking at sarcoid as much. But I think you have to understand that 5 to 10% of people who have sarcoid have certain involvement of cardiac issues, while ventricular arrhythmias are a known manifestation. But remember, a significant proportion of them have atrial fibrillation, as he just showed you. 1/3 of cardiac sarcoid present with some kind of atrial arrhythmias, and it is these granulomas which cause end up largely present in the left atrium. So I think the take-home message is that we must exploit the diagnostics when you look at the atrial tachycardias and atrial arrhythmias. We must want to run after inflammatory markers. And today, I think the availability of good imaging tools like cardiac MRI and PET have made it so much more better. So this is a take-home message that we should really look aggressively and investigate them, and not just put them on any drug, especially as Dr. Shomu said, don't give them amiodarone and forget about them. Look for them, and they could be completely treatable either with an ATT or with steroids, changing their life pattern. So thank you, Dr. Riaz, for a wonderful presentation. I think we'll move on, and next presentation is by Dr. Shomu.
Yeah, thank you, madam. It's wonderful to be presenting in this lecture. Am I audible? It's fine?
Yes.
Yes, you're audible.
Perfectly fine. So as I discussed, Dr. Aparna will be giving her inputs. I will be presenting in case presentations so that after each case we can discuss. This is very important to all the clinical practicing DM, DNB students. What should you do? So the two main venues for discussion would be the choice of a device in the presence of atrial arrhythmia, if you have to put any, and what happens if you have an atrial arrhythmia once the device has been already put in, and what is your clinical presentation as well as the approach. So let us see regarding pacemakers, ICDs and CRTs. And this is with pacemaker. We'll discuss in 3 parts. What is the choice of a pacemaker in a patient who has a symptomatic atrial tachycardia and a patient with pacemaker, and what is a patient with asymptomatic atrial tachycardia which is detected on device. So let us see case example 1, which shows a 75-year-old lady with history of syncope and pre-syncope, no structural heart disease, good LV function, no significant valvular disease. And this is the ECG showing some sinus pauses. But in Holter, if you see, there were long pauses preceded by short runs of atrial tachycardia, and there was unprovoked sinus pause also. And the average heart rate being 55, the longest pause being around 11 seconds. And therefore, the patient final diagnosis was kept as a tachybrady syndrome and investigated with no reversible cause. So what are the options? If you have a tachybrady syndrome, the most important thing is you have to see whether if I treat the tachycardia, my bradycardia will go away or not. But if there is an unprovoked bradycardia without any reason, with no preceding tachycardia, it possibly means there is atrial disease, and it is basically a sick sinus also associated. Because of that, a dual chamber pacemaker plus medication should be advised in such patients. Now, when you give rate control drugs for tachycardia, they will aggravate sinus bradycardia, and hence atrial pacing is always required. And therefore, in such cases, atrial based pacing should be done. Now, only atrial pacemakers can be given. The incidence of AV block on follow-up is around 0.2 to 2% per year, and hence, therefore, the dual chamber pacemaker is the safest. However, to avoid ventricular pacing in such patients, long AV delay or algorithms to avoid ventricular pacing like managed ventricular pacing or VIP should be given. Whether to give anticoagulation, it's a topic in itself. So will any dual chamber pacemaker do? Are all the dual chamber pacemakers the same? No. There are pacemakers which have atrial anti-tachycardia pacing also, and they can actually pace terminate episodes of atrial tachycardia. So this is a patient, this is an example. You have an atrial tachycardia ongoing. There is an atrial pacing done by the pacemaker, however, which doesn't terminate. So there can be actually ramp burst pacing, and it has been shown that around 71% of a regular atrial tachycardia can be terminated by the pacemaker if it is done properly. And a prevention of atrial fibrillation can be there as high as 36%. So any comments, Dr. Aparna, on this case? So how to choose a pacemaker in a patient?
Absolutely. So I think you brought out very well, and I want to want you to re-highlight when you have a patient of sick sinus syndrome. How do you send him home to ensure that he will not be ventricle paced when we have learned we don't want to do it? What is it that you do?
So the first thing that you should note is what is the own AV interval. That's the most important thing. The PR interval is, if it is 200 milliseconds, you need to program the AV interval long, more than 200 if it is a sensed, more than 300 if it is a paced. Because pacing to P wave, there will be a delay. So very important to increase the AV delay than the regular PR interval. In pacemakers, like Medtronic has a managed ventricular pacing where it can be programmed into a AAIR mode, and then if the ventricular 2 beats are missed, then it will switch over to a DDDR mode by itself. So such patients can be actually given a pacemaker which has pure atrial pacing, which can be converted into a ventricular pacing later on. There's something called as a addition. So you can program these as a regular, and there is what we call as a delay that can be given to most. If within the delay the P wave is sensed, it can increase the AV delay to such an extent, maybe even 340, 400 milliseconds. So very important, AV delay should be kept higher.
Again, Dr. Shomo, just for reconfirmation, do you ever worry about the AV delay in a normal heart?
No.
How often do you use reactive ATP or AF suppression algorithms? Do you think about that when you choose a pacemaker in a patient with atrial arrhythmias?
Reactive ATP is only generally I use in patients who have a regular narrow complex rhythm rather than AF. The problem is such patients may actually go into it. So atrial tachycardia may degenerate into atrial fibrillation also. So there is a con to it also. However, in studies, it has been noted that it can terminate and maybe prevent episodes. So there are pacemakers where you can give so there is something called a AF suppression algorithm, where if you record some PACs, the pacemaker will increase the rate of the pacing in the atrium so as to suppress these PACs to prevent the onset of atrial tachycardia or atrial fibrillation. So we use this especially in patients with sick sinus syndrome rather than CHB patients.
Just as a bottom line understanding, atrial tachycardia can be terminated by overdrive pacing.
Yes.
Patient cannot be terminated by overdrive pacing. So
yes.
Shomu said. Yeah.
Right. So can we go to case 2? Yeah, so the case 2 shows a 70-year-old gentleman with heart block, and a dual chamber pacemaker was done 3 years back, was keeping well, and had complaints of pre-syncope, short episodes on antihypertensives also, and echo and CAG already prior done was normal. So what are the differentials when there is a pre-syncope episode in a patient who has had a pacemaker with complete heart block? First, that is high on the list, should be kept as loss of pacing, ventricular pacing, whether the patient is getting anything that doesn't pace the ventricle. Second is hypertension. He's on antihypertensives, whether the episodes are because of a hypotension. And third is arrhythmia. So the ECG in this patient actually confirmed the diagnosis that the patient was having higher ventricular rate, which were irregular in nature, short runs, in between P wave seen, again short run. So, and there was a sustained high ventricular rate on this ECG, which was nearly pacing at 130. So whenever you have a ventricular pacing occurring at a higher rate, that is the upper tracking rate. So pacemaker ventricle should pace maximum at the upper tracking rate, that is programmed to around 120, 130. So if you have a pacing at the upper tracking rate, what you have to consider, A, is a pacemaker mediated tachycardia, and second is an atrial arrhythmia, which is causing this increased rate. So when we interrogate, these are the electrograms. When we are interrogated, you can see that the A waves in the upper channel are more than the V waves in the lower channel. and the rate of which is in the upper channel is around 150 per minute, which is regular. So this confirms that this is likely to be a atrial tachycardia. However, differential of sinus tachycardia should be considered if there is a stress, but there is a ventricular pacing occurring because the patient goes into a mode switch. So now what is mode switching? If the pacemaker detects that the atrial rate has crossed a certain limit, which is programmable, as in here, mode switching, if it exists for certain time, maybe 5 seconds, 6 seconds or so, it will go on. If it is more than 160, it will pace at a DDDIR mode. That means the ventricle will be paced at a rate that is programmed as a backup, 60, 70 or 80, while the atrial rate, so it will not track the atrial rate so as to increase the rate. So this mode switching happening in this patient for 4 times. However, if you see the ECG, it's pacing faster. So that is not only 10 seconds as recorded here. So what must have happened? The atrial tachycardia rate would have been lower than 160. That is why the mode switch did not occur. And therefore, the upper tracking rate pacing would have occurred, which was not normal for this patient. And the second thing that can happen is an atrial arrhythmia may not be documented due to undersensing during the atrial tachycardia itself. So the mode switch did not occur. So what are the options to prevent fast ventricular rates during atrial tachycardia? The first thing is to treat the atrial tachycardia by antiarrhythmics itself. You can decrease the mode switch if you have an atrial tachycardia, but it conversely causes the mode switch to happen if the sinus rate goes beyond this. So that's not a very good way. If there is decreased sensing, the increasing the atrial sensitivity for better detection can be done. In patients who have recurrent atrial tachycardia not treated by the above methods, you can decrease the upper tracking rate so that it will not pace beyond 90 or 100. And finally, you treat permanently by doing an EP study RF ablation. Your comments, Dr. Aparna?
Yeah. So, Dr. Shomu, first I want you to clarify a little bit on an ECG. How should I distinguish a pacemaker-mediated tachycardia versus the rhythm which you just showed? If you can bring that ECG, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So the lower part, if you see the lower part, it's a very regular tachycardia. A regular, broad, complex paced rhythm at the upper rate of 120, 130, if you have. And if this shows a P wave which is somewhere outside in the middle, if it shows that, it's very likely to be pacemaker mediated tachycardia, and suddenly an APC or a VPC will terminate the same immediately. So atrial tachycardias cannot be terminated by a PVC. So what a pacemaker can do is increase the PVARP, and suddenly the tachycardia the pacemaker mediated tachycardia stops. While in atrial tachycardia, you'll have short runs like this. And you can see intermittent here, the P wave morphology also. So there may be some P wave morphologies which are PR is shorter in this. While in pacemaker mediated tachycardia, generally it is a long PR or an equal PR.
Yeah, so I think a very important point again is look at, supposing you fortuitously catch it on a Holter. The onset of a tachycardia dissociation at the upper tracking rate lets you know that you're probably dealing with a pacemaker mediated tachycardia, as he just mentioned. So that was one. And the second thing I just want to highlight what he brought out is that when you give the atrial lead, I think there are several components that you need to look into. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it's good, Aparna.
Okay. So I thought there was some issue. So whenever you give an atrial lead, there are components which you should look at so that you don't face these problems of undersensing. You should want to sense the
Dr. Aparna's voice has gone.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So quickly what Dr. Shomu said, so that you're not faced with the problem of undersensing, whenever you give an atrial lead, you should not just go and put it and quickly come out. Look at the P wave, look at the slew, look at the impedance, look at the threshold, look at the current of injury. Try and achieve all these good parameters when you are positioning your atrial lead in a pacemaker, so you don't face the problems which he just mentioned. So I think let's move to the next case, please.
Yeah, also one more point. If you put the lead very near to the ventricle, it will oversense the ventricle, which will be fortuitously recorded as a AV both. However, with the blanking, it can be converted, so it can be stopped. So that is a more different topic. So let us go to case 3. This is a 76-year-old gentleman with a history of AVR, bioprosthetic valve, and intermittent CHB. He's obese, asymptomatic, not on any medication, and during pacemaker follow-up, you see 2 alerts. Is otherwise okay. A pacing is 3.7, ventricular pacing is 48%, all parameters are okay. But what you see is atrial mode switch episodes 305, and what you see are short runs. So you can see this atrial electrogram up. Now this is a regular rhythm, and suddenly there is a short burst of atrial tachycardia, which lasted for 16 seconds here. It lasted for 5 minutes, 16 seconds here, and it's all V sense earlier, but V pace during. Here you can see V pacing going on. And the longest episode was 1 hour, 6 minutes, during which there was a trigger, that is the AMS. Trigger was there, and there was V pace at a lower rate. So this is the upper rate. If the AMS would not have triggered, the ventricular pacing would have continued at faster rates. The AMS triggers, the ventricular pacing decreases to the programmed rate of 80. However, when the patient was conducting on its own, there was high ventricular rate episodes also. So the patients generally become symptomatic when there are high ventricular rate episodes rather than otherwise. So these patients will not become symptomatic, and therefore in this patient no symptoms were there. So this patient had a AF suppression algorithm off before. There is something that we can detect and we can make it on. So overdrive pacing can be done if there is a PAC noted, and the rate can be programmed to around 115 for around 15 beats or so that the AF doesn't start. What about, so 2 things in this case. First, antiarrhythmics. Beta blockers can be added at least, so that the pacing, the atrial tachycardia may not come back, and second, the ventricular rate may not increase. Sleep apnea testing should be done. That's a reversible cause because he's obese. Whether the patient requires antiarrhythmics should not be, because he is asymptomatic otherwise as of now. The most important thing is anticoagulation. You have documented tachycardia of more than 5 minutes now. He's having a CHA2DS2-VASc score of more than 2. So therefore, anticoagulation should be given. So a total arrhythmia burden, if you see total arrhythmia burden of a count of 32 here in one patient, and if you have long episodes, asymptomatic, the ventricular rate is down, you need to give anticoagulation. So this is an algorithm which shows how to approach for anticoagulation on a device. Confirm that the mechanism is an atrial arrhythmia. How do you confirm that? You show that it's not oversensing, there's no device malfunction, it's not a pacemaker mediated arrhythmia, or there is no noise. If you have a burden of more than 5 minutes and the CHA2DS2-VASc score is more than 2, you recommend anticoagulation. If the CHA2DS2-VASc score is 0 and 1, there is something called as an atria score. And if the atria score is more than 5, it's recommended to give anticoagulation. However, if the arrhythmia burden is less than 5 minutes, atrial arrhythmia burden, then you should engage the patient in discussion to modify the risks and what is the benefit of starting such anticoagulation. And this is the atria score. Any comments, Dr. Aparna?
Yes. So quickly, I think this is a very, very important subject, and we should spend a few minutes here, because whenever patients come back to us for pacemaker interrogations, it is imperative we look at the burden of atrial arrhythmias today, because it should not be just a quick wish-wash, but we must look at the burden. And as he has highlighted so beautifully, you must ensure that you rule out any oversensing. And once you assure that there is an atrial arrhythmia, look at the CHA2DS2-VASc score and look at the burden. Surely today we still don't have complete clarity, but engaging with the patient and a shared decision making with drugs which are so safe today, it is a good idea. He's brought back that page, which is very, very important. Shared decision making, looking at the CHA2DS2-VASc score and the arrhythmia burden. I may not want to conclude a 5-minute burden, but yes, if it is over and over coming in with a high CHA2DS2-VASc score, we must engage with the patient and consider an oral anticoagulation to protect him from a stroke. So I think a beautiful case brought out here, Dr. Sharma. Let's proceed.
Now we go on to the devices, the AICDs and CRTs, and what is very important is atrial fibrillation and ICD. Actually, even before you put an ICD, 20% of them may have already had an atrial fibrillation before implantation, and an ICD may detect another 30%. To total, around 50% patients may have atrial fibrillation. This may lead to worsening heart failure, inappropriate shocks, even because of anti-tachycardia pacing, ventricular arrhythmia induction, and increased thromboembolic events. So that's very important. So we'll discuss with cases. This is a 76-year-old gentleman who was having an anterior wall MI, presented with a monomorphic VT, ejection fraction 30% with narrow complex, cardioverted to sinus rhythm, did not require any coronary intervention, already on beta blockers, and added amiodarone. Average heart rates were 65 and 70, and an AICD implantation was done thereafter after discussing. So we put in a DX AICD lead, which is a single lead atrial sensing lead. So now on follow-up, the patient on amiodarone had, because of ventricular arrhythmia was given, had a heart rate which decreased to 54 now. So therefore amiodarone was discontinued, given that the patient already had AICD and patient's beta blockers were continued. However, the patient presented with 1 month history of worsening breathlessness and pedal edema. And what you see on this is that the atrial electrograms are very random. It's like atrial fibrillation, random, irregular. And what you see is the ventricular electrograms, which are showing irregular complexes. So this patient basically had an atrial fibrillation, which started nearly a month ago. And what you see here is, even with the DX lead, there is undersensing of the atrial electrograms. So the sensing is random here. The patient is still in atrial fibrillation, but the sensing is less. So it detects atrial fibrillation first, but then says back its sinus rhythm, though the patient is continuing to be in atrial fibrillation. So immediately, because the atrial fibrillation was there, rate control was given, anticoagulation was started. After giving that, the activity of patient increased. As you see, the ventricular rate decreased after medications, and the patient's activity increased. So what are the problems that we will face right now? When we give antiarrhythmic drugs to this patient, it will cause more sinus bradycardia, but this is an DX lead, right? And it cannot do a atrial pacing in this patient now. And if we want to increase his ventricular rate, it will cause a ventricular pacing at higher rates, which will increase the failure. So what are our options? Whether to upgrade to a dual chamber or pulmonary vein isolation. So what are the hemodynamic issues of a single versus dual chamber pacemaker? The bradycardia, if it is there, and especially sinus bradycardia is there, atrial pacing should be given. That is very important. Or if you give drugs, or it is expected, especially atrial, so it should be a atrial pacing related device. However, because of ventricular pacing, there can be an increase in the heart failure. What about shocks, inappropriate versus appropriate shocks? So majority of studies have shown no difference in outcome in appropriate shocks with single or dual chamber AICDs. That is primarily because of atrial sensing issues, either because of over sensing the ventricular electrograms or under sensing the atrial electrograms during the tachycardia, addition of lead and a cost in a dual chamber, and when you don't want to pace the atrium, a DX lead can be there. So summary of choice of device implantation, if you have to put any, for patients who want to be receiving a device, young patients with normal heart rate response in whom the chances of sinus bradycardia is low currently, a single chamber AICD suffices, or a DX ICD for atrial electrogram monitoring. Documented sinus bradycardia or expected sinus bradycardia because of drugs, likely you may need to give a dual chamber AICD. And in patients with LV dysfunction with a long PR or a wide QRS more than 150 milliseconds with or without atrial arrhythmia, a CRTD or a hot CRT should be advised. Your comments, Dr. Aparna?
I think that was fantastic. All I want to make a point here is, supposing you've given a single chamber ICD and now the patient has sinus bradycardia. The option you mentioned was upgrade to dual chamber ICD. Just want to share from my own experience what we have done. Because of the economics involved in upgrading to a dual chamber ICD, we have given some of our patients a dual chamber pacemaker with atrial based pacing on the contralateral side. So you can be facing these problems later on. So you can consider leaving the ICD as it is, and you can consider an atrial based pacing on the other side. That's all. I think we can move to the next case, please.
Right. So this will
Shomo,
be
you have been
the last
using the
case.
word. Shomo, just a minute. You have been using
Yeah.
the word DXICD. Can you just expand on what that?
Yeah, so it's like a
Cannot
VDD.
be.
So initially there is a VDD pacemaker that used to come. It had a ventricular pacing, but there was an atrial sensing port which was actually positioned in such a way that that port was there in the atrium, sensing the atrial activity. So it used to sense the atrial activity and pace the ventricle, right? Now, ICDs do not require pacing most of the times. However, for diagnostic purposes, a company, Biotronic, has come up with this kind of device which can sense the atrium electrograms the same way as the VDD, but it amplifies the signal multifold so as to bring out the atrial electrograms much better as compared to a pacemaker sensing atrial. And that is how it may help to diagnose first atrial tachycardia and may help to differentiate atrial arrhythmias or SVTs from VT. So it is said to give a better diagnostic. However, the same issues, sensing issues related, and how much difference that it does to prevent inappropriate shocks. So that is primarily for that.
One more point, just for further clarity, the only place you need a dual chamber ICD would be if your patient deserves an ICD and has sinus bradycardia with a narrow QRS. So this take-home message should be very clear that dual chamber ICD should only be reserved in a situation where your patient has sinus bradycardia with a normal PR interval and needs an ICD. That is the only reason. Otherwise, we don't give a dual chamber ICD. I think Shomu will agree.
Yes, true. Yeah, so the last case will be divided into two. One is the first part, inappropriate shocks. So this is a NRI gentleman who presented to us in 2008, an ejection fraction of 25%. Bypass was done 8 years back. A dual chamber AICD was done way back 7 years before that and upgraded to CRT-D because there was LBBB. He presented with history of 2 shocks. Now what you see in this is basically a plot diagram, and this is the ventricular electrogram. If you see, the plots are the ventricle, which is lesser than the atrium. The atrium are much faster. And what you see here is device was in mode switch prior to detection. That is also important. And what you see here is the SVT limit is 300 milliseconds, right? The differentiation is on, other SVTs are off, and stability is off. So this was the basic parameter. What you see is an inappropriate shock because of fast rates of atrial fibrillation. So what you're seeing here is the atrial rate is higher than the ventricular rate, and the patient has received a shock which terminated the tachycardia. So importantly, inappropriate shocks are 40% because of an atrial arrhythmia, which includes atrial fibrillation and atrial tachycardia. 40% would be around for sinus tachycardia because it has not been programmed well. And 18% will be because of oversensing and other device related or external noise. Most important factors for inappropriate shocks would be atrial fibrillation with fast ventricular rate, which is carrying a risk of around 4-fold. That's very important. And SVT discriminators being off has a higher risk. So very important, these things. So how can you prevent this? See the heart rate threshold, at what the device gave the shock, what is the duration, number of intervals that it gave a shock, and what are the enhancement to differentiate between SVT and VT. So how can you differentiate from SVT and VT? And these are the discriminators that are used by the devices. The first and most important is morphology. Second is onset, stability, timeout, and SVT limit. A word about morphology. What the device does is collects a template in its database saying that this is my normal sinus rhythm, and whenever a tachycardic, so this is the intrinsic rhythm, it gets a template, And whenever the tachycardia occurs, it matches, so it overlaps this template over the own sinus rhythm template. And if it matches more than value of 70%, it can be programmed. However, it suggests that it's likely to be the same morphology and it's a SVT. But if it doesn't match and the programmed value is less than 70%, then it says it's a VT. So that's the most important take home. It's the most accurate of the single chamber algorithm. However, what is about the onset? Sudden onset of tachycardia generally is atrial tachycardia, atrial fibrillation, or ventricular tachycardia, but a slow warm up is generally with sinus tachycardia. So onset, if you have an inappropriate shock for a sinus tachycardia, the onset criteria should be kept on. The last about stability criteria, very important, the RR interval is most commonly seen with atrial fibrillation, right? So more RR variation. However, it can occur in ventricular tachycardia in the initial and the later stage also. However, most important is a persistent RR variability suggests atrial fibrillation, and that gives a clue that this may be atrial fibrillation and this can be made on. There is a programmable rate at which the device will say, after this, I will not consider it to be a SVT at all. So they generally consider 200 and above because SVT should not conduct more than 200 rate. That's the AV node comes into picture. So if it is more than 200 or 220 rate, it will say, no, it's always a VT unless proved otherwise, and it will shock. That is programmable. Lastly is timeout. Even if you detect SVT and it goes at a higher rate, after a certain period of time, the device can shock. That's very important. And if it shocks, you can program it around 3 minutes. So summary to avoid an inappropriate shock in this circumstances: first, prevent the recurrence of this atrial arrhythmia. That is rule number 1. Second is optimize your AV nodal blockade so that the ventricular rate doesn't go fast even if there is an atrial arrhythmia. Third, you can detect. So if it is for primary prevention, there is no VT, you are thinking it's only going to be VF, the programmed ventricular detection can be programmed at a higher ventricular rate for avoiding shocks. Morphology criteria should always be on. Stability criteria should be on for atrial fibrillation, while onset criteria for sinus tachycardia. Timeout and onset do not help, but an SVT limit should be considered if you have an atrial arrhythmia, which is documented, which goes beyond a 200 rate limit. Comments, Dr. Aparna?
Yes, so just one comment that we have to understand that inappropriate shocks because of atrial fibrillation are extremely common, and the pointers which he brought out, we have to use them. Morphology criteria, stability, and onset. I think it should be a policy every time the patient comes back for follow-up. You must want to do this. But what I want to highlight in all of this is bringing back the basics. Guideline-directed medical management of patients of heart failure should be really optimized so as to prevent these from occurring. And we can achieve this with GDMT.
Right. So the last part of this same patient continues, was doing fine. The patient was maintaining on ventricular biv pacing with amiodarone and beta blocker, but he went abroad. So amiodarone was stopped immediately because it was considered as a toxic drug in the long run, and pulmonary vein isolation was done, which is fair. It should be done in all patients with atrial fibrillation and inappropriate shocks. Device parameters were changed to avoid inappropriate shocks for atrial fibrillation. He came back after a year or so, but he was not doing well and was brought to the hospital in significant failure, hypotension, and altered sensorium. And this is what the device says. What you say is, since the last 1 month, the black part is all atrial fibrillation. The patient's ventricular rate during atrial fibrillation shot up. The percentage pacing decreased from 100% nearly to less than 50%, and the average ventricular rate shot up. The optivol, this is the volume overload, shot up. So this patient, because of atrial fibrillation, had a decrease in the pacing, LV pacing. There was a loss of atrial kick. There were higher heart rates, decreased diastolic filling, and increased neurohormonal activation leading to failure. So discussion is what we could have done. Reablation, do a proper pulmonary vein isolation again, additional lies for the second, Second is home monitoring, very important in the current scenario. Alarm could have been given just immediately when the patient went into atrial fibrillation. Third is AV nodal ablation, anti-tachycardia pacing, and allow maybe cardioversion, which is the last. So we'll discuss just a part of it. This is the Castle AF study in NEGM. And what you see is any patient who has undergone an ablation who maintains good sinus rhythm. These were all patients who had CRTD and ICD like our patients. 100% of them had this LV dysfunction. The most important is decreased hospitalization, death from any cause, and worsening heart failure were much lesser in patients who had undergone an ablation. The only problem is in ablation in India would be it should be done in expert hands who do atrial fibrillation regularly. The risk of ablation and the risk of recurrence need to be done, and need for further procedure, as in this case, should always be highlighted. And obviously the cost benefit in India is to be considered. The second most important right now is a home monitoring. And you can program that if any, so it's a programmable parameter that if any atrial arrhythmia or a ventricular arrhythmia is detected, immediately an alert goes to the treating physician or the hospital, which can alert the patient to change his medication or come back to the hospital for a review. So if the patient would have come immediately, it would have done wonders treating this arrhythmia. And the study, that is the result study, showed that the hospitalizations due to heart failure were much lesser as compared to patients who were not on the study. Third is AV nodal ablation and atrial arrhythmia. So current guidelines, if you have LV dysfunction, atrial fibrillation fast rates, you give a CRT in such a patient or a HIS pacing, that is a physiological pacing. Patients who have recurrent AF, who is already on a device now with a fast ventricular rate, what can you do? So if it's a CRTP or a D and you cannot treat it otherwise, you can do an AV nodal ablation and come out. There's nothing more to be done. However, if you have a AICD and there is need for a AV nodal ablation, you will have to upgrade it to a CRTD or a HIS bundle pacing. In a patient who has not LV dysfunction and you have this problem, you can do an AV nodal ablation and evaluate, because then you have a ventricular pacing already being there. So if you have a chronic AF, you have a LV patient who has a device, a single chamber device, let it pace and see whether the LV dysfunction progresses or not. However, if the LV dysfunction progresses, you may need to have an upgrade to a HIS bundle pacing or a CRT at that point of time. The fourth point was an anti-tachycardia pacing that we had shown in a pacemaker. And these are two big studies which showed that anti-tachycardia pacing in such patients with device patient was very effective, as high as 70% terminated with atrial tachycardia and 36 prevented atrial fibrillation. The mean burden reduction was around 87%. And last not the least, patients who received inappropriate shocks, as we say, during an episode of atrial fibrillation, the atrial fibrillation terminated in around 92% of patients. So shock is effective, but whether you need to give a shock for such a patient is very important. Your comments, Dr. Aparna.
So all I want to tell on all of this was that two things which really make it important for us to understand was the mention of Castle AF and home monitoring. We have to remember Castle AF told us that AF ablation is really rewarding for those patients who have poor ejection fraction. Home monitoring again told us that it is of great value in reducing the morbidity and mortality in those patients who have poor ejection fraction. So these two elements which Dr. Shomu rightly brought out, we have to remember that we have to offer these therapies for those patients who have poor ejection fraction because it has mortality benefits.
Yeah, summarizing, Dr. Aparna, this is a patient who was basically could not be treated for this because he expired, but definitely now summarizing all these cases, atrial arrhythmias in patients who are undergoing CED require more knowledge, need to choose the device appropriately before you put the device. That's very important to understand, because if you tell that you need to upgrade later on, it's additional cost, it's an additional problem that you'll have to undergo, the chances of infection increases. The second thing is you need to intervene when we detect an atrial arrhythmia. So first, determine its clinical significance. And second is whether the patient requires a medication to control it or requires an anticoagulation. And with AICDs, if the patient is having inappropriate shocks, program it appropriately, treat the underlying cause. Worsening heart failure, if the patient should be told that even if you feel breathless, please come to the hospital if you're not on home monitoring. It may be an atrial arrhythmia. You need to monitor your weight. You need to monitor your heart rate. That's very important. That's part of protocol rather than just saying that you're all okay otherwise. So, and intervention like an ablation or a home monitoring in high-risk patients can be given nowadays very easily and should be always told to the patient. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think in your summary slide, can we just go back to the summary slide,
Yeah.
please? So I think what I have begun in all of my patients, before I give them a CIED, irrespective of what the reason is, I make sure we do a Holter. I think exploiting a Holter gives you a sea of information before you are going in. Take an additional 24 to 48 hours to decide what am I to do, because just on the basis of an ECG, going ahead and implanting a single chamber ICD may not be the best option. It gives you the arrhythmia burden. So fall back on the age-old diagnostic modality Holter, which really comes rewarding. So I think thank you very much. And we want closing remarks by Dr. Shomu.
Yeah, if there is any other questions before we close, I think we'll be happy to address any comments from Dr. Yash, Dr. Ashish, any of the senior consultant, Dr. Highgrave.
No, Shomu, it was a good symposium. I listened to most of it, and I think all the moderators' remarks also very good. I missed in between, but I'm sure there must have been audience questions, and the postgraduates must have benefited well from this important subject.
Yeah, keeping in line with the need.
I just had one point to add. I was listening to Aparna talking on ivabradine, but please also remember that there is some data that ivabradine may also increase the incidence of atrial fibrillation. So that is one point to keep in mind. So in atrial fibrillation, as of today, there is no role of ivabradine in my opinion, but some atrial tachycardias, and Shomu has published some also, some atrial tachycardias which are automatic do respond to ivabradine. That's the only point I wanted to.
I completely endorse what you're saying, sir. Completely endorse.
Yeah, I think in keeping with the mind, the postgraduate program that it is, I think Shomu has designed it well to cover all aspects of atrial tachycardia, as many as, and given a lot of new concepts starting from ECG through ablation and devices. I think that was a pretty complete job and benefit a lot of postgraduates. We had about 100 plus attending at any given time, and almost 85 to 90 were present all the time. So I think it was worth the effort. Shomu, you want to say some things that?
Yeah, I think I should thank IHRS to have given this platform to all these postgraduates to learn what we are seeing in and day out. And it's also very important to give an opportunity to our junior consultants and residents to come up that will encourage them to bring up. Dr. Rujuta, who was second year, did a wonderful job explaining. Dr. Riaz, as a consultant, he presented well. So this gives a good opportunity for them to, so your theme of having junior people to present should do wonders maybe 5 years from now, and that will help in growth. And I would also thank Dr. Highgrave and Dr. Aparna for their pearls. It's really nice to have you here as our guest faculty, and thanks for taking time. Thanks to all the people who have listened up, and hope that this sessions would increase your knowledge and maybe help you troubleshoot in difficult situations, and you know when to refer patients to your colleagues as electrophysiologists rather than handle many a times by yourself. Thanks.
Right.
Thanks.
Right. As the clock strikes, I think 11:50. We have had another useful session of EP through the IHRS DMD teaching program, and next time we will again get staff from a big institute to similarly teach all the cardiology postgraduates in the country. So just spread this message, and the links and things like that will be available to you from your HODs or program directors. But also try to contact you directly, but make it a point to use this to your advantage. Thank you.
Yeah. And one more thing, sir, Dr. Samir and team. Yeah. So the residents have put together all these cases, and that's very important. When they get the opportunity to do this, it does good. So that's very good.
Part of the training, right?
Yes.
Thanks, Shomu, and all your staff, and to both Dr. Haigreev Rao and Dr. Aparna Jaswal, and particularly to Dr. Yash Lokhandwala for making it a point to be online in this session. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you next month. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.